In this final section, we're going to talk about mixing some of these alternative sweeteners. We didn't collect data in our lab, but we thought it would be helpful to talk a little bit about some stories or anecdotal evidence about how different companies making different products are able to achieve their goal and have the same texture and taste and so on using a mixture of some of the sugars that we mentioned. So the way that we're going to set this up is I will say the obstacle, and then Mary is going to give the solution. So the first obstacle is related to high intensity sweeteners. Here the obstacle is that you can only use a very small amount, because if you have too much, it's going to really affect the taste or maybe have a negative impact on the gut. So when using a high intensity sweetener, what's the solution here?
Yeah, it's going to be good for that nice, quick, sweet profile like the monk fruit we were just talking about. But we need to make up the mass different. So adding a bulking agent, maltodextrin, polydextrose, inulin fibers to replace the mass that's lost there.
And the next example, and you mentioned this a little before, ice cream. So if you are changing and using an alternative sweetener, then you're going to lose some of that water binding, and there may be an effect on the freezing point depression. What's the solution for this type of product?
Yeah, there is not just one, I want to point out, but as an example, this is one. You can use erythritol, as we mentioned before, because it does do a good job of that freezing point depression, which you need to be able to make an ice cream. But, maybe you would add something else like stevia or some other bulking agents to fill in some of that, to have a good mouthfeel on your ice cream. So it's still kind of a blend. So you could start with erythritol for the freezing point depression, add a little stevia for the sweet, and then have to add a bulking agent to fill out and have the good creamy mouthfeel that you're looking for.
I'm getting hungry as we go through this. So next, let's do nutrition bars. I see this more and more. A lot of nutrition bars want to lower the calorie in that bar and make it as healthy as possible. So the obstacle here is that when you remove the sugar actually has a huge impact on the texture profile of these types of products. So you might get a hardening effect that you were trying to avoid, or, I see this all the time where companies replace a component like sugar, and then all of a sudden their whole product is different. So what could we do here as a solution if you're removing sugar for this type of product?
Right. So maybe a good solution for this one is the allulose, and for the sweet. And then it does have a lot of good properties that are similar to sugar that we spoke about before. Then you can also add some soluble corn fiber, and that is also going to help bulk out, keep the good texture, maintain the taste and the shelf life. And if you remember, one of the things that sugar does is it slows that staling process and that protein coagulation. So, yeah, no surprise when you look into it why that's hardening. So.
Mm-hmm. And we actually have a project right now where we're looking at some nutrition bars. So hopefully more on that later. Now let's talk a little bit about taste profiles. So you might have an obstacle where you have delayed sweetness. So with sucrose, you expect it to have a very specific taste. It's going to hit your tongue in a certain way. But as you start to use some of these alternative sweeteners, that sweetness might show up later, or it might not be the same. So how could we think about formulating for this?
Right, like as an example, like stevia kind of has a delay in the sweetness and maybe a little bit of a odd taste after as well. So you could blend that with like allulose or tagatose, which has that initial burst of sweetness that a consumer would look for. I mean, there's also going to be some other added benefits for that as well. But for that, if you're looking to get that quick burst of sweet, those would be good.
And then what if the obstacle is an off flavor? I've heard of monk fruit having kind of a melon rind flavor or off taste, and stevia, like we've mentioned, might have a kind of a licorice taste. So what can you do to combat these off flavors?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I've seen where they've actually combined those two together, and it actually neutralizes their off flavors and provides a neutral sweet. So it's kind of interesting that they can have this kind of synergistic effect when you blend them together.
And then finally, what about erythritol? We've mentioned this a few times. It has kind of a bright effect or a cooling effect in your mouth. what might you do if you're using this specific alternative sweetener?
Yeah, and stevia, I've seen that too, where they put a little bit of stevia in, and it kind of settles down that bright, that cooling effect. One of the things we didn't mention, and we were just talking here earlier, was xylitol, which is very similar to erythritol in that cooling effect. You'll find it in gum, and it's also one of the reasons when you if you ever get like a cinnamon gum and it's always like a cinnamon mint, it's because of the xylitol, because of the cooling effect in that artificial sweetener.
Interesting. And then this last example we have here is just a baked cookie. So if you're going to reduce the sugar and use an alternative sweetener, then there's a impact on the spread, right?
Yeah.
If you're trying to cook this. So how might you overcome this type of obstacle?
Yeah, so I wanted to put this example and discuss it a little bit because we've been talking solely about these alternative sweeteners, but there are other aspects we need to consider, and there might be other ways to adjust your formulation as well that isn't just about sweet. And this is a good example of that, where you don't get the spread that you're expecting when you have a reduced sugar plus an alternate sweetener. So one of the ways to do it is to actually increase your fat to flour ratio, and you'll definitely get that spread, and then you can reduce your baking time. So that might be another way to look at adjusting your formulation to account for the lower sugar.
So just as a summary, I know we've talked a lot about sweetness, but you also have to consider those adverse flavors or some consequences, like the gut consequences. And you may need to add other functional ingredients. If you're removing your sugar, you may need to add an emulsifier or some type of stabilizer or bulking agent. And like you said before, keeping it in an amorphous state is extremely important, so that we don't get that crystallization in that water that's kicked out.
Right.